Okay, question 3a. Describe what is meant by data validation. So validation and verification are checks that we use on data input by the user. So important to know the difference between these two. So verification requires the user to check the data. So if you type in your name, you'd verify that by outputting the name that you typed on the screen and asking, is this correct, yes or no, or asking the user to type it in again. So verification is performed by the actual person entering the data, whereas validation is different. Validation is done by the computer. So we create a set of rules and the computer uses those rules to check the data that's been input, to check that it meets a set of rules. That's all we can do. We can't tell them if it's right or wrong or correct. We can just check it meets a set of rules. So let's pop something on for that. So data validation is a check on data input carried out by the computer using a set of rules. Now at this point, I think that's good enough for 2 marks. If you said a check on data using a set of rules carried out by a computer. But just to be sure, I'm going to throw in an example. Don't be afraid to throw an example in just to support any answer that you do. So I'm going to say, e.g., we could use a presence check to see if data has been input. Okay, so I'm happy with that one. Let's move on now. Well, let's have a look at the mark scheme for that. So validation is an automated check carried out by the computer. Yeah, so I've said that is a check on the data carried out by the computer using a set of rules, and to make sure data entered is sensible, acceptable, reasonable. So I think the fact I've mentioned set of rules here, that's an interpretation of sensible, acceptable, reasonable, but also my example would secure the second mark if the person marking it was unsure. But I think I'm pretty happy with that. That should get 2 marks quite nicely. Right, a validation check. Let's move on to part B. A validation check is used to make sure that any value that is input is an integer between 30 and 200 inclusive. Give one example of each type of test data to check the validation check is working as intended. Each example of test data must be different. So let's have a look. So we've got normal test data. So normal test data is data that should be accepted. So between 30 and 200 inclusive. So I'm just going to pick something in the middle. So I'm going to pop 100 and I'm going to say 100 is data that should be accepted. Okay, so normal test data. Right, abnormal test data is data that is, for example, this we've got a range here, is data that's outside of the range. Now, you might also argue that you could put the word cat, for example. So that's also an example of the wrong type of data. So it's the wrong data type. So abnormal data is anything really that will stop this from working. So I'm going to put cat is the wrong data type, will not be accepted. Okay, extreme data. So we've got when we've got a range of data, extreme data is usually the highest or lowest value in a range of data that will be accepted. There's another type of test data that you could be given, which is boundary data, and boundary data is data either side of what should or shouldn't be accepted. So for example, for this one, an integer between 30 and 200, the extreme data for this one should either be 30 should be accepted or 200. So they're the extremes of what would be accepted. Okay, so it says between 30 and 200 inclusive. That means that 30 is acceptable and 200, but 29 won't be and 201 won't be. And that's boundary data. But anyway, we want extreme data. So the mark scheme says 200. So I'm going to put 30. You could say 200, and I can say this is data at one end of the range accepted. I think that'll do. Right, let's have a look at the mark scheme for this one. So we've got normal data, 75, so it's data that lies in the required range and should be accepted. So 100 is data that should be accepted. That's fine. A normal test data, I've put cat. So cat is the wrong data type and will not be accepted. So that's all good. Then extreme test data, they've put 200, so they've got the highest value that should be accepted. And I've got this is data at one end of the range accepted. I could say this is data at the lower end of the range that could be accepted, but I've given a definition of what extreme test data is. Acceptable answer is either end of the range that should be accepted. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that one. I'll stop this one and on to the next question.